But that moment in the Rauda is special because you're very close. Allah. SubhanAllah. It's one of the qualities that happens only in Ramadan, that you talk about these things and it's as if they're in front of you. It's as if you're there when they're happening. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وأشهد أن محمد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم. Alhamdulillah, as we all know, today is the day of Badr, and that's why there was no difficulty in having Badr in the title of the talk. And the reason that I chose between Badr and Uhud is because one of my great teachers, Colonel Muhammad Rahim, that we worked together on the book Jesus Prophet of Islam, and one of the things he often used to say was, he said the whole of Quran, the whole of commentary of Quran is between Badr and Uhud, because these two battles were very different, and they each had different lessons and different outcomes. And you could say that as a subtitle that really they illuminate the difference between obedience to Allah and His Messenger and not complete obedience to Allah and His Messenger. This is the difference. And this is something that we're faced with ourselves throughout our lives. Once we've entered that entrance to the deen, that gateway to Islam, which is to say, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammad Rasulullah. The Prophet ﷺ, he said, these words are easy on the tongue, but a lot hangs on them. And once we've gone through that gateway, then life changes, and every day is different. And every day we come up against the nitty-gritty of whether we are obeying Allah or not, as best we can. Sometimes it seems it's too much, but other times we know we're just being lazy or whatever, or we're being like a horse, that comes to a jump and then turns away at the last minute and refuses to jump. So this is why the nafs, the self, is often likened to a horse, because in order to ride a horse you have to have the halter to guide it and to give it commands. And it's the same with yourself, with your nafs. You have to have the halter of knowledge so that when you come to a jump or to a fork in the road, you can steer your path in the best way, inshallah ta'ala. I just wanted to say a bit about the Battle of Badr, first of all, because on the face of it, the Muslims faced overwhelming odds. Altogether, there were 313 people. And when they were making their way to Badr, which is a very important point at that time, not so much now, but at that time, it was where the road to Medina, to Mecca, and to Syria, to Damascus, met. So it was a key meeting point for travellers and for, especially for the caravans, which used to go often between Mecca and Medina and Sham and Damascus, especially. So, strategically speaking, it was a key point. And when the Muslims had news that the Meccans had gathered an army and were coming to get them, basically, with the intention of killing the Prophet ﷺ and his followers, and wiping a very early Islam off the face of the earth, as it were, they immediately got together and went towards Badr, and they were walking mostly. They had 2 camels and a few horses. They had not very many weapons. They were very poorly equipped, militarily speaking. But they had a very strong trust in Allah and the Rasul, and this is, in the end, what carried the day. And there are stories also that, that even though There was one man, who was a very good fighter, but he hadn't accepted Islam, and he said, I'll come and give you a hand. And the Rasul said, well, do you affirm that there's only Allah and that I'm his messenger? And he said, not at the moment. And he said, well, then we don't need you. And some people were kind of a bit surprised, because they thought, well, he would have really helped. But already the niyyah of the Rasul was very clear that this was a battle between the mu'minun and the kafirun. So if anyone was sitting on the fence, they could stay there until they made up their minds. And you also when you read the accounts, it's not possible to go into all the accounts this afternoon, but even the very young Muslims really wanted to come. They didn't want to be left out. There was no fear in people's hearts, that they wanted to meet this threat full on and deal with it. And some had to be told, you're too young, look after your parents, whatever. And some would pretend to be a bit older than they were and, kind of sneaked in. But really there was this high confidence, really, and trust and aspiration in Allah that the Muslims would be victorious. And when they arrived at Badr, and this was on the Friday, so they left after the Jummah, this was on the Friday evening, they had been fasting, because fasting had been made obligatory then. This was only the second year after Hijrah, but Ramadan had been made obligatory, and many of them were fasting, even though they were traveling. And they arrived, and then there was a combination of you could say inspiration, of wahi that came to the Rasul sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and also just practical common sense. So he said to his companions, where do you think we should position ourselves? And they said, well, we should be near the wells. There were several wells, but we need to be especially look after the well with sweet water, the ones where the water wasn't so good but which animals could drink. They said, well, we can disguise those, we'll hide them, so that when the Quraysh arrive with their army, they won't have access to water. This will be against them. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, well, that's a very good, tactic, good strategy. So they did that, and they protected the well with sweet water. And the Prophet actually walked on what would be the battlefield the next day. And he said, really it was to boost the confidence, but he could already see what had happened tomorrow. He'd already seen what was going to happen, because you can go into the unseen, you can go into the malakut, and then you're out of time and space, so you can travel, if you like, you can do time travel very easily there. And he said, well, so-and-so is going to be killed here, so-and-so is going to fall here, Abu Jahl will be killed here, Abu Lahab will be wounded here. And he was, pointing out these places, even before, this was the night before the battle. But this inspired confidence, obviously, in the Sahaba. And then in terms of preparing for the battle the next day, he said, please do what I say. Don't engage the enemy until I say. And then when they're close enough, then the archers will fire. And then when they're closer still, then it's stones. And when they're closer still, then it's hand-to-hand fighting with weapons. So, he gave very specific instructions about how they were going to conduct the battle. And then, as was often the case, to begin with, there was single combat, because often armies, when they met, they would take the best from each side and have single combat. And sometimes that would decide the whole battle. Depending on who won that would decide the whole battle. And in fact, Sayyidina Ali, all the times that he fought like this in single combat, because he was one of the best fighters, he never lost. He always won, but sometimes they still had to have the battle as well. And this was what happened. There were a few single combat battles, and every time the best fighters of the Kafirun were killed by the people fighting them, especially Sayyidina Ali. I think he fought twice, and then the time came for the meeting of the armies, and it was extraordinary, because throughout this time they had built a shelter for the Prophet from the sun, and he was making dua, and he said, Allah, if you don't give us victory today, then who will establish your deen? He was putting it in those words, who will establish your deen? So really, failure is not an option, is another way of saying it, but he put it higher above success and failure. He just said, who will establish your deen if you don't give us victory? And it was interesting, because even in the single combat, one of the people from the Quraysh was one of the sons of Abu Bakr. And when he came and challenged anyone from the Muslim army, Abu Bakr said, let me deal with him, his own son. And the Prophet ﷺ said, no, he said, Abu Bakr, I need you next to me because you're my eyes and ears. You know, he valued his advice so much that he kept him close. He said, let someone else do it, which they did. And so Abu Bakr was always at the Prophet's side during the battle. And when the conflict began, although they were heavily outnumbered, it was a miraculous event, especially as we know from the Quran when the Prophet ﷺ picked up a handful of dust and threw it in the direction of the enemy and made a dua against them. From that moment, the tide of the battle turned, even though it was like, I think, 1200 to 313. The tide of the battle turned. And it's said that, the commentators say that when he threw that handful of dust, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, specks of it went into the eyes of all the fighters from the Quraysh army, so they were kind of like blinded by it. So they couldn't really see what they were doing. Then added to that, the angels were also helping them. So Sidna Jibreel was there fighting, and Mikael and Israfil, and Israel was busy, collecting souls. But, and then a whole army of angels was also fighting with them. And some say that their turbans were green. Some accounts they were white. And Sidna Jibreel, I think, had a yellow turban. But there are all these kind of details. And the Sahaba would be about to, strike a blow against one of the enemy, and their head would fall off even before they had made the move because an angel had beat him to it. So with that kind of overwhelming force, there was no doubt about the outcome of the battle. And in the end, the army of the Quraysh retreated, the ones who were still alive, and the ones who had been killed were piled into the wells or into pits and covered in stones. And the Prophet ﷺ spoke to some of the dead bodies, the corpses, and he said, have you found out what your Lord has promised to be true? Because I have found that out. I found that what Allah has promised me is true. And the Sahaba said, can they hear you? And he said, yes, they can't speak back, but they can hear me as clearly as you hear me. So one is aware that in this battle there was this whole unseen element of what was in the unseen, from the Prophet ﷺ seeing the day before already what the result was going to be, but they nevertheless still had to fight the battle. They didn't say, well, there's no need to fight it because we know we've won. They still had to fight the battle. People still died shaheed. And if you haven't been to Badr, you should visit it. It's an extraordinary place. And you can still feel as if the battle took place yesterday. I've only been to 2 other places in my lifetime like that, where a big battle has taken place. And you can still feel it as if it's just happened. But in Badr, it's amplified. And of course, there's 14 shuhada who are buried there. And it's obviously a great sunnah to visit them and greet them and make a dua for them. And you can be sure that they hear you, even though they can't reply to you in a voice that you can hear. And it's a reminder, because people's lives were on the line. It's not only the deen was on the line, but people's lives were on the line. And what marked the battle clearly and the outcome was that, firstly, the mu'minun were completely one body. Allah had brought their hearts together, as we heard from the ayah that Dr. Said recited. He said, even if you'd spent everything in the whole world, you couldn't have brought the hearts together, but Allah brought the hearts together. And because Allah brought the hearts together in that way, nothing could divide them. And that's why the end of that what Dr. Said recited is Ya ayyuhan nabi hasbuk Allah. I can't even remember it now. Sorry, something that comes. Sorry, وَمِن تَبَعَكَ. And so Allah is enough for you and for the mu'minun who follow you. And on that day, all the Muslims who were there were following the Prophet 100%, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And therefore, there was no fear in their hearts. There was no anger against the Quraysh. One of the attributes of their hearts, the condition of their hearts, was complete sukun, complete stillness. And because they had no fears and no anger, they were just dealing with something that Allah had sent against them by His decree, and they were dealing with it by Allah's decree. And this was a key mark event, because if you go back just 2 years when the Prophet was forced to make hijrah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, at that point he had to take refuge in the cave of Thawr, again with Abu Bakr Siddiq. And as we know, Asma brought them food, and they were protected by the miracles of the spider's web and the doves laying eggs in a nest out in the tree outside the cave, mouth cave. So at that point, they really had to leave very secretly in order to escape. And then by the time of Badr, 2 years later, they were facing the enemy face to face. They were facing face to face the people who wanted to kill them, and they were dealing with them. And so this is a key turning point in the early history of the Muslims. And then after that became other amazing things, like Sayyidina Ali marrying Sayyidatah Fatima and Hassan being born. All of that happened in the next year. And then a year later, a bit later, it was just in I think about the 7th of Shawwal, so it's a year and a week after the Battle of Badr, came the Battle of Uhud. And again, it was a similar situation, but this time the battle wasn't in Badr, it was in Uhud. And what happened was, again, because the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't rely on Sayyidina Jibreel and Allah telling him everything that was coming. He would send out people to keep a lookout, and see what these people are doing, watch the routes from Mecca, find out what people are planning. And so they were aware that the Quraysh were seeking revenge, and they had prepared an even bigger army, and they were making their way towards, not to Badr, but to Medina. And so the Prophet ﷺ said, well, I think we should stay in Medina and defend it. That was his initial take on the matter. But he asked the Sahaba, and he said, well, what do you think we should do? And some of the younger ones especially, who wanted the kind of taste of battle on the battlefield and victory, rather than being under siege, they said we should go out and meet them in the open, and deal with them like we did at Badr. And there was this discussion, and in the end, as often the Prophet did, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he would actually go with what people advised rather than what he thought. That was his personal opinion. I mean, if it was an ayat of Quran that was revealed, then they would follow it. But if it was something that was inspired in his heart, he didn't always follow it. He would listen to other people, and then they would make a decision. And so he said, okay, we'll go out to the foot of Uhud, which, as you know, is not far outside of Medina. But he said, we'll have the mountain behind us, and then we'll meet the Quraysh. And then when they were preparing to go, some of the men, the young men, had second thoughts. And they said, well, have we made a mistake? Should we have listened to the Prophet, what he originally said? And said, yes, whatever you decide, we'll go along with it. And so they actually went to him, and he came out. He'd already got his armor on. And they said, we've been having second thoughts, that maybe we were a bit hasty in suggesting we fight outside Medina and avoid coming under siege and just deal with it on the battlefield. And maybe we should follow what you first thought. And the Prophet ﷺ, he said, and again, with his knowledge of all the prophets, he said, once a prophet has put on his armor, he never takes it off until the battle's over. So we will go to where we planned yesterday. And this is what they did. And then, again, when the Quraysh army came, they were facing each other, two armies facing each other, and again there was the single combat. And again the Muslims were victorious. And with this battle, it was a different terrain. And before Uhud, but at their rear, was this hill. And the Prophet ﷺ said to the archers, stay here, guard our rear. Because there was room for Quraysh to come round behind where the Muslims were stationed. There was room for that. He said, stay there. Don't leave this place. He said, even if you see the vultures gathering around and heading for Muslim corpses on the battlefield, stay here. It was a very strong indication of tactically what they should do. And and of course they agreed. And that was before the battle had begun, so there was no room for questioning. It was such a clear order, really. And then when the single combats were over and the battle began, it was very fierce. And again, a lot of people on both sides were being killed. There were a lot more martyrs in Uhud than there were in Badr. And because at that point the Muslims were completely united, as they had been in Badr, in the end, even though they were again outnumbered a lot, more than 2 to 1, they would gain the upper hand. And it reached a point where the Quraysh gave up, and started to flee and leaving all their valuable possessions behind them, because they wanted to run and travel light. So there was a lot of potential booty there. And so the people on the ground began to go after them and also to go after the booty. And then the archers didn't want to get left out. They thought, well, that's job done, that's the battle, that's over. And so they forgot what the Prophet had said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and they joined in, the rout, what appeared to be a rout then. And it was at that point, as we know, that Khalid bin Walid ordered his cavalry to come in round behind them and attack the Muslims from behind, because they no longer had the protection of the archers to stop that. And then, it became a very tense situation and very fierce fighting. And the Sahaba gathering around the Rasul, just to protect him from being hit and from being killed, which was a very real possibility then. And as we know, he was wounded. His helmet was crushed down on his head and his teeth were broken. And there was a point when he actually fell. And it's said that he wiped his forehead and there was blood on his hand. And it was just about to, drop on the ground. Subhanallah. And Sayyidina Jibreel reached out and caught the blood, just a drop of blood. He said, if this drop had landed on the ground, nothing green would have grown until the Yawm al-Qiyamah. That was how much barakah he had in his veins. So it was a very tense moment and very fierce fighting. And when you read the accounts, there were these accounts of great acts of heroism. I don't know all the names off by heart, but there were people who really shone in that situation, in that very pressing situation, and who protected the Rasul. And at one point, the standard of the Muslims, the flag, had fallen, and what the Prophet ﷺ thought was Musab, was a man called Musab, picked up the banner, and held it high, so the Muslims could rally round it. And the Prophet said, "Gather round Musab," and then the person holding the banner said, "I'm not Musab, I'm an angel. I just look like Musab." And so he told him to give it to another of the companions. But again, you have this whole dimension in the unseen, that the Sahaba and the Prophet ﷺ were being helped by the Malaika, by the angels, by Sayyidina Jibreel and by other angels. And some people say that whereas in the Battle of Badr their turbans were green, in this battle their turbans were red. Allahu alam. But they were there and they were helping. But again, the Muslims really had to push themselves to the absolute limit just to survive. And as we know, Hind, the wife of Sufyan, wanted to avenge the death of her son at the hands of Hamza at the Battle of Badr, and she had actually hired her slave to kill Hamza, the uncle of the Prophet ﷺ. And she said, if you achieve this, you will be freed, you will be given a lot of wealth. She gave him all the incentives, because obviously for him it wasn't personal. And he waited for his moment. And when Hamza slipped on some mud, part of his armor opened up, and Washi put his javelin through that gap, and killed him. And after that, we learn that Hind and the Quraysh, they mutilated many of the bodies of the Muslims, and she actually kind of took out his liver and started eating it. It was really very barbaric. So there were these great tragedies that happened, great Sahaba who died, great warriors who died. And although the Rasul confirmed that they'd all died shaheed, humanly speaking, it was still a loss, for their loved ones, for the wife who was left, for the children who were left. They had just lost their father or their husband, so it's a difficult time. But in the end, what happened was that the kind of fight back from the Muslims against the tide of battle moved in favor of the Muslims. And the Prophet ﷺ was taken to a high point where he could rest. And he actually had to be carried by Talha because all his strength had gone from the fighting. And in fact, at the back of where the battle took place, you can still see today, there's a place in the rock where the Prophet ﷺ leaned back against the rock, and it sort of formed into a hollow to support his head. And you can still see that hollow. If you find someone who knows where these places are, you can still actually see it, and you can see how the rock arranged itself around his head to support it, and then he was carried higher up to a place of safety. But then the Muslims continued fighting until the Quraysh did properly retreat and didn't come back again. And Khalid bin Walid couldn't come around again. So the battle ended, but it wasn't as clear-cut as had been on the day of Badr. And people always say, well, if the archers had followed what the Prophet said, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what happened would not have happened in the way that it happened. It would have been a different battle completely. And the Quraysh would have kept running the first time they started running. And they wouldn't have come back. And Khalid bin Walid wouldn't have been able to maneuver around behind the Muslims. So it all turns on that, just that very simple command, which when you're under pressure makes complete sense. If we're being attacked, then defend this hill. There's so many battles that after that battle where you read, if you command the high point, then you command the battle, basically. And nowadays it's in the air. It's not even on the top of a hill. You command the air, you command the ground. But in that situation where it seemed that the battle was over, they went after the dunya, and they went after the spoils of war. They went after the fleeing people to finish them off. And that was the mistake. And it's sometimes a mistake that we all make, when we're involved in some kind of struggle. It's not necessarily a battle, but there are many kind of battles that we have in life. And sometimes when you think it's all over and you say, now I can relax. And if you do that too soon, sometimes you find that you've blown it, basically. And it's like the saying of the Rasul, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, that the moment is sharp. If you don't cut with it, it cuts you. And so this is what happened in Uhud. Because they didn't hold firm, this is what happened. All those things happened. But it was a lesson. And this is another thing you find in life, that sometimes you have to go through that kind of process in order to learn that lesson. If the companions had always obeyed the Prophet in everything, it would have been too good to be true, and a lot of lessons wouldn't have been learnt. And the same with our lives. Allah gives us mistakes so that we learn from them. He even gives us wrong actions so that He can forgive us. Because if we never had a wrong action, how could Allah show that He's Ghafur Rahim and Ghafar, the oft forgiving, and Al-Afu, when on the Laylatul Qadr, when we say Allah, when we call Him on the name Al-Afu, which means the one who obliterates any trace of a wrong action, not even the consequences of it, but often even the memory of it is gone. That's how complete that forgiveness of Allah is, that the record is completely erased. And if none of us had wrong actions, Allah wouldn't be able to manifest those attributes to His creation and to His slaves. And so this is something that we take on board, that when we do not completely obey Allah, inshallah we will learn from it, and then we'll say, that act of disobedience was a gift, but I won't repeat it. This is one of the requirements of tawbah. So you say, well, I won't do it again. Sometimes you do, and you have to make tawbah again, because Allah is very Ghafur Rahim, is very forgiving. And the Prophet ﷺ said the door of tawbah is always open. It's always open. It's not you have one chance and that's it. As long as you turn to Allah, Allah will turn to you. And this is something very important to bear in mind during this second third of Ramadan, because today it's not only the day of Badr, but it's also, we're in the second third of Ramadan, where basically we've been softened up by the days that have gone so far. And now we have the ability to taste and to recognize just how forgiving Allah is. And part of that is our turning to Allah, because you have to be muhasib, you have to look at your record and say, how can I put things right? Where have I fallen short? Where have I let people down? And this is the best time of the year to do that. This is the best chance, other than obviously the Laylatul Qadr, where you can ask for everything. And if you catch that night, you can ask Allah for whatever you want. And part of it is that you ask Allah for forgiveness. When Sayyidatuna Aisha asked the Prophet on this special night, what dua should I make? And he gave her that dua, Allah, you're the one who forgives and you love to forgive, so forgive me. And that is at the heart of Laylatul Qadr, even though it's in the last third of Ramadan, which is Itq min an-nar, freedom from the fire. So already we're focusing on what it's like to be in the garden, because in those last 10 days, we have a taste of the garden. Even though we're in the dunya, we're not really in it. It's a bit like when you're in the Rawda in Medina, you're not really in this world. The Prophet ﷺ said this is one of the meadows of the garden. So as soon as you set one foot in the Rawda, you're in the garden. You're not in the dunya anymore. And this is why it has a timeless aspect to it. And again, when you go to Medina, head for the Rawda. You make sure you get there and spend time there as much as you can. I know they make it much more difficult for the ladies there at the moment, but if you're determined, you will get there. There are times when it's open just for the ladies, and you can get there and you can sit there and you can do your 2 rakats and you can make dua and you can greet the Rasul and he will return the greeting. So avail yourself of that opportunity, because this is one of the actions which protects you from the fire in a very real way. And the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever visits me, I will intercede for them. And we know that whoever the Prophet intercedes for will be given the garden. There's no record in any hadith that says the Prophet will intercede and Allah will say, sorry, not that one, he's staying in the fire. It's not like that. Whoever the Prophet intercedes for will end up in the garden. Even if they had to go to the fire first of all, he will not cease interceding for anyone who said La ilaha illallah, not even Muhammad Rasulullah. Anyone who said La ilaha illallah once in their lifetime, he will intercede for them. So imagine then that if you're in the situation where you're in the Rawda, and inshallah you're on your way to Hajj, or you're on the way back from Hajj, or you're on your way to Umrah or back from Umrah, so already inshallah your wrong actions have been wiped out, or they're about to be wiped out, because these are the results. When you go on the Hajj, all your wrong actions up to then are gone. The same with an Umrah, everything up to that wiped out since the last Umrah. So for that reason, you should always say, Allah, make me a frequent visitor, make me a frequent traveller to the Haramain. Let me put up with whatever rubbish goes on there, because there is rubbish that goes on there, but let me see the people who are the people that you love. Let me see the people of Barakah, let me see your awliya, let me see your salihin, and put me with them. And give me a Hajj or an Umrah which is accepted and full of barakah and knowledge and openings, sweetness and light, all of these things that you ask for. And but that moment in the Rawda is special, because you're very close. Allah. SubhanAllah. It's one of the qualities that happens only in Ramadan, that you talk about these things And it's as if they're in front of you. It's as if you're there when they're happening. Allah, I always remember once, I was in the Ramadan, I'd just been in the Ramadan, and I was just leaving. And it was very crowded. I think it was during Ramadan actually, so it was very crowded. It's often more crowded in Ramadan in the Haramain than it is during the Hajj time. And as I was leaving, there was a man trying to get into the Ramadan, and we kind of met just outside the Ramadan. And he had this wonderful smile on his face, and I think I did as well. And we just kind of smiled at each other, and then carried on our way. But it was a wonderful moment of recognition of what a special place the Rauda is. And I remember another time, it was when I had a lot of debts, and I didn't know what to do about them. And I thought, well, while I'm in the Rauda, I'll ask Allah to get rid of them, and so I kind of went with that intention, which was a very kind of base intention. And then I found myself next to a person, who had spotless white clothes and very dark hair, and no sign of travel on him. And he was in sajda, and he was just making dua for the Rasul and his family and his companion and his followers. And they were just pouring out of him. There wasn't something that he'd learnt by heart. It was just coming out of his heart spontaneously. And obviously someone who really loved the Rasul so much, and completely abased before Allah, but asking for all of these blessings on the Messenger, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And I was so embarrassed. I thought, I came here to make this stupid dua about being relieved of debts, and here's what I should be saying. So it was a very, very clear lesson that use your time in the Rauda well. Don't waste it. And at the heart of this, you see, is that ayah where the Prophet is commanded to say by Allah, say, if you love Allah, follow me, and then Allah will love you and forgive you your wrong actions. So you see this very close connection between love of the Rasul, love of Allah, and how do you get to that point? It's through obedience. It's through following the Rasul. So it's not that in the Quran, that the description of the Muslims is Sami'ana wa atana, we hear and we obey. That's the basic foundation for any Muslim. You get the message, you follow it. You don't question it. You don't say it should be different. You just say, if that's what Allah says, Bismillah, I'll do my best to do it. But it's beyond that blind obedience. It's something much greater than that. It's an obedience that comes out of love and out of trust. And when you reflect on the trust of the Sahaba, at Badr especially, but also the determination of the Sahaba at Uhud, that they would not let anyone kill the Prophet ﷺ. They wouldn't mind them being killed. People would leap in front of the arrow or the sword or the spear that was going to hit the Rasul, and they would take the blow and they would die shaheed. But they had that determination and that love for him that he would not be harmed. And if you have that love for the Rasul, then of course you follow him. Qadi Ayyad in Ashifa, he says, one of the signs of loving someone is that you imitate them. You find out everything you can about them and you imitate them. He said this is one of the signs of love of the Rasul. The more someone takes on the Sunnah, the more it indicates that they love the Rasul. They're not trying to find a way around and say, well, I'll do it differently. They say, well, this is how the Prophet did it, is good enough for me. I'm going to try and do it the same way. And this is what brings the deen alive. This is what brings it alive. And when you have that love for the Rasul, it's very easy to obey him. And when you obey him in that way, then Allah loves you. And when Allah loves you, then He forgives you your wrong actions. And if you're asking for Allah's forgiveness in Ramadan especially, and on the Laylatul Qadr especially, but also all these other special times for making du'as, whether it's on the Jummah, between the two khutbahs, when the adhan's given, in that time between Asr and Maghrib when du'as are answered, in the last third of the night, when Allah descends to the lowest heaven and says, which of my slaves is calling on me? There are these special times that we know that you make a dua, and Allah says in the Quran, ask and I will answer. I'm near. He says, I'm near. Ask, I'm near. And we sometimes forget that. We say we make dua to Allah as if He's somewhere up there, beyond the galaxy. But in fact, He's closer to us than our jugular vein. Wherever people are, Allah is present. He's not contained physically by any form. Geographically, He's not contained. Time continuum, He's not contained, because He's the first without any beginning and the last without any ending. So He completely encompasses everything. And whatever you think Allah is, He's not that, because your head is not big enough to have an understanding, to have a concept, to have an idea of the reality of Allah. And this is why we put our heads on the ground and say Allahu Akbar and Subhana Rabbi al-Ala. We're in our lowest position, glorifying the one who is high. And it's this calling on Allah constantly, which you could say guarantees that Allah will forgive you. We're not a people who say, oh, we're these terrible people and we keep on whipping ourselves, and even though I've asked Allah to forgive me, I don't deserve it, and I'm sure He won't. And it's not like that for the Muslims. We have a high expectation of Allah, and we expect Him to forgive me. He said, I'll forgive you, then Allah, we expect you to forgive us. That's it. And we expect you to give us actions which are pleasing to you, and to bar us from even approaching actions which are not pleasing to you. There's always this conversation that goes on between each one of us and our Creator, with no intermediary. There's no priest saying, don't worry, your sins are forgiven, just give me some money and be fine. That doesn't happen with us. It's full on. And this trust, this love for the Rasul and for Allah is what will carry us safely through life. Not just through this Ramadan, not through the year after and for however long we're on this earth, but it will take us until the point when we die. And then inshallah, when we die, it won't be difficult to say Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah, Ashhadu anna Muhammadur Rasulullah as our last words, because this is a good seal. And it won't be difficult when we've been washed and prayed over and buried and the people have left us, and Munkar and Nakir come to question us and say, who is your Lord? What is your book? Who is your messenger? What is your deen? It won't be difficult to answer those questions because we've been living them all our lives. And this is one of the greatest gifts of Allah to the Muslims, that we have this possibility to lead a life which is pleasing to Allah and which is rewarding not only for ourselves and the people around us, but it is a reward that has no limits. And it enables Allah to show His generosity. And it enables the Prophet ﷺ to intercede for us and put in a good word for us on the Qiyamah. And so Allah, we ask that when we're faced between obedience and disobedience, that you always guide us to obedience, even when the disobedient act seems the best act in the circumstances. Allah, we ask that you give us the furqan, that we always have the action and the intention and the words or the silence, the stillness or the action which is most pleasing to you. And Allah, we ask that you protect us in our journeys through life, and we ask that you lead us safely to the Hawd in the Akhirah. And we ask that we drink from the Prophet's hands, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And we ask that we are with all the people that we love and the people who loved us. And we ask that we have a vision of you as clear as how we see the full moon and the sun at midday in this world. All the things that you have promised Allah, please fulfill your promise in the best way for all of us. And Allah, we ask this for all of the Muslims. And we ask it for all of the people who are coming to Islam. And we ask Allah that you bring many people to Islam in this time. And that the more the kafirun try to wipe out Islam and wipe out the Muslims, the more you strengthen it and strengthen the Muslims, and the more you establish the deen, so that your deen is uppermost in the land. Allah, we ask that England becomes a Muslim country, that Europe becomes a Muslim continent, that America, North and South, become Muslim continents. We ask that we live to see this change from a situation where following the deen is sometimes like handling hot coals. We ask to taste that salam and that peace which will come when Sayyidina Isa returns, as you have promised. But we ask that we have a taste of this, even if we're not here when Sayyidina Isa returns. We ask that we have a taste of it, and certainly in our hearts, Allah, we ask that you give us hearts which are still and peaceful and full of light and full of love for the Rasul and love for you and trust in the Rasul and trust in you. And may we understand our deen, and may we live it, and may we love it, and may we die on that so that we are raised on that. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Malik Yawmiddin. Iyyaka na'budu wa iyyaka nasta'in. Idina as-sirat al-mustaqim. As-sirat alladhina an'amta alayhim. غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين آمين. اللهم صل على سيدنا محمد عبدك ورسولك نبي الأمي وعلى آله وصحبه وسلم تسليما عدد خلقك ورضا نفسك وزنة عرشك ومداد كلماتك سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون والسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله. Thank you. أشهد أن لا إله